Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Rekha, co-founder and CEO of Bujify. With me, I have Rohit Jinka, co-founder and president of Bujify, and Cathy, owner of Playful Strides. Cathy has over 30 years of experience as an pediatric occupational therapist. So today's webinar is going to be about baby's first bites. So this is third webinar series among in our newborn 101 parent learning series. So moving on. So the agenda for today's webinar is basically, so it's going to be a quick introduction about us, who we are, Bujify and Playful Strides, impact of cultural and societal beliefs around eating. Eating is a skill with regard to the feeder, and eating is a skill with regard to baby, and setting up for success on the eating habits, followed by Q&A. Who we are. Bujify. So Bujify is a child development company promoting healthy and well-rounded development of the child right from the birth. Our offerings are play rigs, which are Montessori inspired and age based. Each play rig, it consists of right set of tools and toys which are required for the baby's development, and also a digital play guide which provides information about the what the parent can expect from the child at that particular stage with regard to their baby's development, and different activities which the parent can play with the baby for that particular stage in order to promote child development. So here is our play rig lineup. So we have it from the newborn until 1 year old. So each play rig is specifically focused on the developmental milestones of the child for that specific stage. For example, our newborn play rig, so it focuses on building new brain connections and vision development. So as you see, most of the items are in high contrast colors, black and white. So the rollover cleric, so it has toys which focuses on building the core muscles required for the development of the baby in order to roll over, and it encourages tummy time. So similarly, each play rig is very much focused on the developmental milestones of the child for that specific stage. So with regard to playful strides, Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name's Cathy. I'm an occupational therapist. I fell into feeding intervention for children and infants by working in different environments where children were really struggling with eating. So as an occupational therapist, I work on skills that families need or find that they're lacking to support a child in being the best they can be. And one of the biggest stressors for families when children are very young is eating. So this workshop is really on that early development and some basic information to support you in managing that information.
Thanks, Kathy. Okay, so yeah, now so Kathy, so you could take it over from here.
Sure. So eating, as you know, if you've ever fed an infant, can be very complex. From when do I feed them? How much do I feed them? Who feeds them? Do they do a bottle? Do they do breasts? Do they do bottle and breasts? When do I start solids? Are they ready for solids? What solids should they start? And there's so much information out there. I'm just acknowledging eating is complex. And in this picture, this child is basically being force fed, and he is not having it. So he's not ready for what is being presented to him. And it looks like actually his mouth is full. So if you just move to our next slide. So, how we fall into eating challenges or into questions about feeding is related to how we were brought up and the beliefs around us around food. So, some foods are seen as more nutrient dense than others. This is actually a positive way of looking at food. Eating until full is what we want children to do and to stop eating when they're full. We want to fix the food so their body is ready to eat it. So for some children, they do better with crispy food than they do with puree. So setting them up for success by setting up the food so their body's ready to eat it. The next real big societal belief that is sometimes hard to understand but all food is okay. So if a child is eating Cheetos, that's okay. We just want to look at the balance of nutrient dense food to foods that don't have as much nutrient density. And the variety of food is required for the healthy body. So those are what we consider positive societal beliefs on food. What we get into difficulty with is when they're all or nothing approaches. So healthy food is good and junk food is bad. So then what I consider junk food may not be what you consider junk food. And we see this when children are older and less when they're young. So when a child's in school and they've brought special chips for school because it's after Halloween, and the lunch monitor says, oh, that's an unhealthy lunch, that child then feels shameful about the food they're eating. And we don't want that happening with children. And we see it follow down when we say you can't have ice cream until you've eaten your broccoli. So you're making broccoli bad, ice cream good. So we want to be aware of the language we use around food. The next one is finish all food on the plate. So here's a rule of thumb. Every child needs tablespoon of a protein, starch, fruit, or vegetable per meal. So one per age. So if they're 10, they need 10. If they're 9, they need 9. But if you think of that, and a 1-year-old needs 1 tablespoon of a protein, 1 tablespoon of a fruit or vegetable, and 1 tablespoon of a starch. So that's like a cracker with a slice of cheese and maybe something on the side like strawberries. It's a very limited volume they actually need because they eat 6 times a day. The next one is I made this food and I put a lot of love into this food, and you're rejecting me because you're not eating the food. And maybe the food is too warm, too cold. It's not the right time. I have to poop. There's lots of reasons why kids don't eat. And we have to be aware that sometimes what we are projecting onto our children is not really what their children are feeling. So I really like the line of I made this because I love you, so please eat it. And you see that in so many cultures. Like, well, you just have a bit, just a bit. It's okay. I made it for you. It's really good. Just a little. I'll just put it beside you. Maybe you'll eat it. That sort of pressure doesn't actually help children learn to eat. And really, in their first year, they're just learning to eat. The other thing we see a lot is if you eat 5 bites, you can get dessert. And so the kids sit down at a meal and they negotiate from the very beginning. So they see meals as a negotiation period. And we really want to see meals and eating as a social time, not as an adversarial time. Can you go to the next page? There we go. So there's a woman named Ellen Sater who now runs Ellen Sater's Institute. And she's a dietitian. She wrote a book called Child of Mine. And she has a great line in it that says, the adult provides the right food at the right time, and the child decides if and how much they eat. And when we break that boundary, so the child parent provides the food in the right way, so breast or bottle or spoon or finger, they provide it and it's made correctly for that child. So that child maybe is only at purees and you're providing them purees, or they're only at finger foods that are straight lines and you give them to them. But we're not giving them a whole grape because that's unsafe. So we know these things and we make sure our child is got the right food at the right time. And then the child goes, yeah, no. If the parent honors that no, the child will come back to them. But if the parent doesn't honor that no and pushes through and says, no, no, you're going to eat this, then you break the trust around food. And that boundary and trust issue is the main reason I see kids. So breaking trust can be like hiding things in food. Like they won't eat their broccoli, so I hid it in their favorite pancake. The bad thing about that is they then notice the broccoli in the pancake and they won't eat pancakes. So now you've lost the food, and we don't want that for you. The other thing is you can break trust when they perceive there's a pressure. A good story I have is I had a older child I was seeing, and there was an infant in the house, and they were speaking Russian, so I didn't know what was being said. And grandma was saying to the mom, she's going to choke, she's going to choke, she's going to choke, she's going to choke. And that's all she was saying to the mom as she was feeding her child. And that anxiety was just through the whole house. And this child was not going to choke, but it was grandma's concern that the food they were giving them wasn't the way she wanted them to be giving them. So we have to look at some of those pressures that we might feel on ourselves by others around us, as well as pressures that we feel on getting enough food into a child. If we honor a child's system, they may eat poorly at breakfast and great at lunch, and then have two really good meals and then a horrible meal, and then have a bowel movement and eat like there's no tomorrow. So kids don't eat the same food at the same time every day. They eat a little bit differently every day, depending on their energy needs and on how their body feels. Can we go to the next slide?
Yep.
So you'd think, well, eating is just something we know how to do. Well, it's actually until the age of about 2 months, it is. It is, we have this thing called a rooting reflex. If you touch the side of an 8 weeks old mouth, they'll turn their head and latch. And that's a rooting reflex. And it's a reflex that's there to help children survive. So they latch, then they suck, and then they swallow. And when they're doing a nutritional suck, meaning they're drinking something, it's a suck, suck, swallow. And they'll get up to 5 sucks to a swallow by about 8 to 10 weeks. If every time they eat, it's uncomfortable because maybe they have a food allergy or the dance between the caregiver and the child isn't fantastic, they may start rejecting the bottle and they may learn that eating's not fun. A good example of it was my niece that was fed by bottle from birth, and they had a bottle maker. So you put the bottle underneath, the formula would come down, the water would go in, and she'd start to get fussy at about 3 weeks, and she'd hear the machine and she'd still. And when the machine stopped its brrr at the end, she would get really angry that the food wasn't in her mouth yet. So she had a good relationship with food because she understood I get food every time my tummy is hungry, and this makes me feel safe and good. If children struggle at that beginning, latching or sucking, or they have difficulty with managing the volume coming at them because the nipple size is too big or there's a letdown from the breast, that can cause a child to have difficulties. There's piles of things you can do for different individual scenarios. So it can be a change in position, it can be a change in nipple, it can be a change in bottle position, it can be bottle feeding over breastfeeding, but you can bottle feed breast milk. There's lots of different things you can do so the dance gets better between the caregiver and the child. Around 8 weeks, that primitive reflex of rooting goes away. So you have to have the ability to understand, I see a nipple, I suck. There is a difference between a nutritive suck and a non-nutritive suck. So one of the things a lot of families get into is dream feeding, which is they get the baby really sleepy and then they feed them. And that's actually quite dangerous for children because they move into a non-nutritive suck. So they suck, 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 swallow. But there's no routine to it. And because there isn't, they will swallow the stuff into their lungs. So we want to make sure that children are awake when they're fed. Can we move to the next line?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Well, we'll get to that one.
Yeah, we'll get to the Q&A. I think, yeah.
Just go up at the bottom of the screen. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we go into food relationship. At around 2 months, kids have a food relationship. They either learned how to eat or they've learned how not to eat, either or. So children start to identify positive and negative behaviors at 2 months. If their needs are met when they require food, they associate eating with safety. So that makes me feel good. It makes me safe. If children don't find that, they associate with danger. So we want to make sure that if a child has had a choking incident or if they've had a bad feeder, that when we go into their meals after that, we make sure it feels safe for them. So what are the things that make a child feel safe? Consistent routine. So some children get their diaper changed, wash their hands, sit in their high chair. That's the routine that says we're getting ready to eat. It might be that it's mom who feeds you during the day and dad who feeds you in the evening, that when daddy sees you, says, are you ready for dinner? So there can be different things that make that food relationship work well for a child. Can you think around the positive and negative experiences you've had with food? what are the things that made it positive and what are the things that make it negative? I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to think about that. Okay. Now that we've had those minutes, it may have been the environment that you were in. It may have been the people you were eating with. If you're young enough and you've had lunch monitors in school, because they've only been around for about 15 to 20 years, it might have been the comments that the teachers made or the school made. It may have been comments that your friends made about your body or comments you heard in your head about food. So that impacts on how we perceive food for children. And all the time, we always want what's better for our child. So if we want what's better, sometimes we are undoing some of the unhealthy things we had as a child. But to be aware that your family was doing the best they can with the skills they had. And as you add in new skills, you're also going to have to explain to the other people in your life why you're doing that. So it might be, I had to eat everything on my plate, and that always made it feel like a lot of pressure. I don't force my kid; they eat till they're full because I want them to have a better body schema than I had at their age. So just keeping it a very positive is really important. The next thing is there's such thing as mindful eating and distracted eating. So mindful eating is when you sit down at a meal and you enjoy the meal. So you're thinking about the meal, you're talking about the meal, or you're just aware of all the flavors and everything that happens with it. And I had a meal with a feeding guru, and she was, I think there's cinnamon in this. I'm like, I'm not that mindful, I guess, when I eat because I don't recognize all of them. And the chef came out and she says, I think there's cinnamon. He goes, you tasted it? Oh, that's lovely. But she's a very mindful eater. She's aware of what her mouth is doing. She's very focused on a meal. The other way we eat and what we see with a lot of kids is distracted eating. I'll call it the iPad eating. The kids don't eat unless there's an iPad in front of them. What that causes, as we all know, is you to overeat because you're not paying attention to what's going in your mouth. It's automatic and you're paying attention to the show in front of you. When children are eating by screens, they're not paying attention to what's happening in their body. So, as much as possible, we suggest children not have a screen in front of them when they eat. If they really need something in front of them, I suggest a book that you're reading while they're eating. So, you read a page, they eat a bit, you read a page, they eat a bit. Because some of our kids just don't have the capacity to sit for long enough to eat. And so, for you to know, an infant under, let's say, 9 months, will sit for maybe 10 minutes for a meal. A toddler, you're looking 15 max. When you get to a 2-year-old, 20 minutes. These meals should not be long. So if you're spending a very long time or expecting a child to say a very long time at a meal, they will not enjoy the meal because it's very difficult for them to stay in one place for that long a period of time. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, how do we get the airplane to land or the spoon in the mouth? Well, sometimes it's not a spoon. So we have to look at a child and are they ready and engaged in food? Do they have some language around food? So more is a very good one, or no. Children usually have gestures before they have words. Are they socially engaged? Are they looking at food? Are they grabbing your spoon? Are they showing interest and understanding of that stuff that's on that spoon or on your plate can go in my mouth? And we have to be careful of the language we use about the child and food. So I hear a lot of, they're just a picky eater. So the child will turn to me and say, I'm just a picky eater. So I don't eat those foods. So to be aware of the language we use around food and the words we use about the food are important. But the real important thing that everyone should be thinking about is a meal is a time for social engagement. It's not so much about the food as it is about the connection. So it might be grabbing that infant and bringing them to the table at 6 months and having them sit with the family for a meal that they're not eating at, and you're throwing a teether toy with some puree on it for them to play with while you're at the meal. So they start to get the social aspect of a meal without being expected to do anything in the meal. It may be that they eat first, have a break, and then come sit at the table. It may be that he eats first or they eat first, and then they go and do something else because it's just too much when we have the 10 people at the table. So recognizing how much your child can engage. What's lovely about this picture is the child is looking directly at the parent. He is engaged in that food and he's controlling that spoon because he's biting on it. So it's not being pushed into his mouth. And his hands are fine. Like they're not full of gunk and they're not being kept clean all the time. Can we go to the next slide?
Yep.
Okay, so the first thing is children need to be able to sit before they can eat solids. So the first picture, which is a trip trap chair, I think, which is white, that child is well supported in that chair. They're ready to eat. So their ears are over their shoulders, which are over their hips. The picture below, although it's a lovely chair, that child is sliding. So he is using everything like sucking to hold himself up. And in that picture, he's actually not sitting fantastically. So that child isn't actually able to sit, but is being brought to the table. The other one, the chair is too tall, and I can't because they've glistened it. They've blurred it. It's harder to see, but it's a little one in a big high chair, and it might be great for bottle feeding, but probably not the best for spoon feeding. So we always want to think of your hips or your stable hips or hips under a trunk that's straight, over a head that's over a jaw, because your jaw is what you eat with. And if our body is not supported and we're rounded, then our jaw sticks out and it can't do what it needs to do for eating. And if you're the other way arching, everything's in the back of your mouth and it's very hard. So everybody can try this now. Put your feet on the floor. I want you to tuck your butt under, and I want you to let your shoulders fall where they are because they'll round. And this is the position of the boy in the gray wraparound at the table. So he's in this position and he's using his hands to suck to hold himself up. Now, if you come back up to straight sitting, I want you to just lean backwards. Okay, so that's what the child in the high chair is doing, is he's leaning backwards. And what you find yourself doing is bringing your head forward just to balance that being pulled backwards. So when you're looking at a child in sitting, a good thing to looking at is, can they sit independently without a wobbly head? And in the chair or whatever I'm putting them in, is it working for them? So, and you can just, the easiest thing to do is put them in it and take a picture, because it's way easier to look at a picture than it is to look at your child in the position. So you look at the picture and you say, yeah, they're sitting great. Then they're ready to go. A lot of children eat best on parents' laps, and I'm going to let you know that now. That connection and closeness is very helpful to them. It's also the position they've been in for breast and bottle feeding. So sitting away from you is more of a challenge. If we're doing that, we typically will turn the child towards us so they're still seeing our face, and we don't feed them at the table from behind. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
Okay. So then there's big questions. Do I do baby-led weaning? Do I do it traditional? Do I follow what I had done? And I'm going to say it depends. What is your level of comfort in letting children explore a food? So are you concerned that they're going to choke on a food every time they eat? I would not do baby-led weaning. Baby-led weaning is awesome if you have the skills. You need to actually understand how food texture changes with cooking. So if you're not someone who's comfortable around managing food or cooking food, it may not be something you do every day. You may still do it, but you may not do it every day. And what pressures are you on finding around food? Is it the family's like, you need to eat more protein, you need to eat more protein? Is it they need to eat lots of food at every meal? And why are you changing to a baby-led weaning if that's not what you grew up with, or culturally it's not what you do? So a change in eating for a child can impact on positively or negatively on the stress in the home. So to be aware of those sort of things. If you're really interested in this, Feeding Littles is run by a speech therapist and a dietitian, and they have a little course on baby-led weaning, which families find very helpful. And the Get Permission Institute also has a free webinar on baby-led weaning. Now, traditionally, the guidelines have changed. So the American and Canadian Pediatric Society have shifted the role of when children start to eat. They brought it down. You started food with children at 4 months. They've moved it back to 6 months and have stated that children should have head control in sitting. The second thing they've done is they've basically said, whatever you want to feed your kid, doesn't matter. So if your family usually starts off with congee, and which is the top of rice with different herbs on it, awesome. If your family usually starts off with baby cereal, cool. It doesn't matter what food you feed your child first. There are only two big rules. One is not to introduce certain allergens early because it can cause difficulty. And the second big one is if you're introducing a new food, don't introduce another food within 3 days. And the reason for that is if there's a sensitivity, you will not notice until after. Okay. And so those are the basics around eating starting foods. When you feed a child, it doesn't matter what you feed them on. So it can be on your finger, it can be on a teether, which is actually my preference when I'm starting with a child. I actually will flip a spoon around and feed on a baby spoon on the flat end so they can suck the food off. But you want to make sure when you're feeding a child a puree that they're fed with a very shallow spoon so they're not getting too much information. When children start to eat, they actually have difficulty with keeping their tongue in, and that's just they're learning. So expect them for the first 5 to 6 weeks, really push the food back at you constantly. And it's because they have a tongue thrust, because they haven't figured out how to move their jaw separately from their tongue. But they'll get it if they just need practice. If you're putting food in the mouth of a child who's consistently pushing his tongue out, giving him some downward pressure and pulling back helps them bring their lips around it, and it will reinforce the proper method for eating. Can we go to the next page?
Yep.
Okay. So there's two things that are real important from an OT perspective. Is the child engaged or not engaged? And can you co-feed? So engaged means they're tilting towards the food and they're looking at the food. Anything that pulls the body away is a negative head tilt. So the picture on the top right is a child saying no. A picture on the bottom is a child saying yes. And then we have a picture of a child on the left who's definitely enjoying his food. He's wearing it. And when we look at the child on the left, he can probably feed himself a little bit, but it's going to get really hard for him quickly. So I want you to notice the orange spoon. So code feeding is when I feed you a mouthful, you feed yourself a mouthful. I feed you a mouthful, you feed yourself a mouthful. I may load the spoon and hand it to you. And Feeding Littles talks about the 3-spoon method, where I load one, you have one, I have one. So when I give you another one, you drop one because children like something in either hand. So you can load, they can have two and you can be loading one. And that is really helpful when a child starts to fatigue in eating, but is still interested in food. They will continue to eat if you feed them until they're full. So is your child leaning in or leaning away? And will they allow you to co-feed because then they have some control? Our next slide. So then we get into kind of what to feed on. These are my favorite. They're called num nums. And the reason I like them is because they're flat, so you can't put too much on them. They have holes in them. You can't see the holes because the food kind of sticks to them. And the children can suck them off with their tongue, and it doesn't cause their tongue to push forward. But I use flat or flat tools, silicone, rubber, or plastic. I don't use metal. And the reason I don't use metal is they get hot. And so we can burn our child without it. If for some reason you're using a metal spoon, test it on the back of your hand to make sure it's not hot before it goes in their mouth. For some children, they really don't like spoons. So I will use other things like teether toys and fingers, clean ones, to help them. And so there's a link on here for the 3-spoon method as well. Always, when you're sitting down to feed a child, please wash your hands as well as their hands before you feed.
Yep.
Next slide, please. I think we're at the end. Okay, so this is, I think, our last slide. It is. So the basic rule is eating before 1 is just for fun. They get most of their calories through liquid. So at this time, we're setting them up for the rest of their life in their relationship with food. It's a great time to focus on engagement and building skills, because if we work on engagement and building skills, when they hit that terrible 2s and they feel they can control the food around them, they will already have an engagement with food that isn't a parent and child control issue. Children first suckle. That's what they do when they're 1 to 8 days old. Then they learn to suck. Then they learn to munch and finally learn to chew. So munching starts at around 6 months. It's when they can bite up and down, but their tongue doesn't move. Then they learn to chew. And chew is a rotary movement that the teeth bite down on a food and it scatters. And then the child's tongue gathers that food up and puts it back on the chewing surface at the back of their mouth. It doesn't necessarily mean they have teeth there. They're just grinding it with their jaw. Chewing only starts if we build skills like rolling, because you have to lateralize your tongue. You have to move your tongue to the side in your mouth for it. And you need to be able to move your whole body in that position before you'll do it with your tongue. We have to practice putting objects in our mouth because children have a frontal gag as protection when they're born. So you can get a nipple in their mouth, but if you go too far back, they gag. And when they are about 6 to 7 months old, they start to push their fingers in their mouth because they're getting teeth, and they walk their gag backwards. So it's not unusual for 7 and 8-month-olds to gag themselves. We have to allow them to explore food with their hands before their mouth, because if it hasn't touched their hands, it won't touch their mouth. And I have a great example of this with my nephew, who was about 12 months old, and my sister was feeding him pablum, which he'd never had. And she put it in his mouth and he spit it out and played with it with his hand and then put it back in his mouth. He needed to understand it before it went in his mouth. By 22 months, a child should be able to manage most tabletop foods. They will still have problems with anything gummy, like gummy bears. They shouldn't have until 5. And lettuce. Lettuce seems to be a real challenge for them. At this age, anything that is round should also be cut in quarters. So hot dogs, grapes, etc., because they're exactly the size of their esophagus and their trachea. So if they choke on them, it's hard to get them out. And the more experiences they have below 22 months means they'll have better experiences trying to be after 22 months. So our goal is experience before 2. And if they have lots of experiences, we've opened their palate to many flavors, they're going to be more able to eat a variety of food and be curious and possibly be a foodie. And that's all I have for you today.
Perfect.
So do we have questions?
So we have questions of our own, but before we jump into those questions, just wanted to ask everyone or remind everyone that if you have any questions, put them in the comment section, and we are going to go through them one by one. So the first question I have is, so Rekha and I, we together have like 4 or 5 questions, but we are going to give a chance to our viewers today before we get to them. So the first question here is, when should allergens be introduced? Sooner rather than later?
Well, that depends. It depends on whether your family has a history of allergies. So if you have someone in your family that has anaphylaxis to things, they usually, with discussion with your physician, they usually hold off on that allergen. It's interesting because in North America, we don't give peanuts, which are a legume, to kids until over a year. But in Europe, kids have legumes and peanuts very young. So it really depends on your cultural background. There are only 2 foods we really watch for, and that is strawberries before 1 because of salmonella poisoning, and then peanuts are the other big one. If a child is having a food and he's having a sensitivity to it, and you're holding off a new food for 3 days, you can note that child has problems with that is sensitive to that food. Children typically don't have an anaphylactic reaction the first time. They have a sensitivity to. They might get a little bit of hives. They might get itchy. They'll push the food away. They won't want more. So that is something that is obvious. Now, if children have a history in their family of the 8 major allergens, which are eggs, peanuts, dairy, I'm blanking, gluten at all, and they're on the back, you'll see on any food you get that's bought, they'll be bolded on them. So just to make it easier, the ingredients, they're bolded. They're mandated in Canada and the US to be bolded.
Sure.
So I would say it depends on the family, but typically it's only peanuts and strawberries and honey that we worry about.
Actually, before going to the next question, I have a follow-up question on this one.
Sure.
So, one of our friends mentioned, I think around the baby was 1 year old, they got the
Mhm.
baby tested for
Mhm.
several allergens just to make sure. So, could you tell us a little bit more about that kind of testing? Like, what
Okay,
is?
so allergen testing typically in Canada, or at least in Ontario, is not done below 2.
Mhm.
So they may have testing done, but the scratch test that they don't do below 2 because the kid's skin is too sensitive and it shows many false positives. So to be aware, if a child needs that testing done, it should be done in an environment where they can react quickly if there's an anaphylactic reaction. And then the second, probably biggest piece is don't test the kid for things like if there's no issues. Because so if a child has, I have kids that have milk allergies, right? But we don't know they have milk allergies. But one of the things we notice is they gag on applesauce, which is a key sign to us that they don't like the grit of it,
Mhm.
and they're irritable all the time. So we say, let's try no dairy for a week. And the parent comes back 24 hours later and goes, I met my angel of a child today because they've been irritable as anything. So sometimes it's just by elimination, you
Mhm.
can figure out those issues. But typically they don't do testing below 2. People will go to a naturopath and get tested. Um, they're, and I can't really comment on that because I don't know the testing that well. But I
Got it.
can tell you the first thing a doctor will do is actually check their autoimmune reaction, IgA and IgB. And if those are high, they'll send them to an allergist to be tested. And the allergist then determines what kind of testing that can be done. But the only testing that really tells is if they either do a micro trial of the food or if they do a skin test. Those are the two real gold standards. Anything other than that are not as accurate. So
Understood.
don't test a kid who doesn't need to be tested. It's really irritable.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, moving on to our next question by Karima. So, how do we decide when to increase the number of times food is given to a 7-month-old?
Okay. So still recognizing that they're going to take most of their calories through food, through liquid. Typically, we would start off with 1 meal a day. If they show a lot of interest when you're eating, you can always increase that, recognizing they're going to get maybe 30, 40 calories through a meal. Um, it depends on the size of the child. Like if you have a big boy, I'm trying to think. I had a nephew who was 26 pounds at 7 months. He ate a lot, right? His brother was 14 pounds at 7 months. He ate little. So some of it is dependent on how hungry you feel your child is,
Mhm.
but at the same time, recognizing they're practicing eating until this point. So typically we would go to bottled and food. And then around 8 to 10 months, we're going to flip and we're going to do food, then bottle. So they're getting most of their calories through the food and they're topping up with a bottle. But we wait until they really have good skills of chewing before we do that because it's puree. You have to eat so much puree to get enough calories. But if you're eating something that you can chew, you need less to eat. They're still like the babies are born and their stomach is the size of a walnut, right? So it can't take a lot. And as they get bigger, it gets bigger, um, but it doesn't grow quickly. So a little one is going to have like a less than a fist size stomach. So you can't give them a lot all at once. So typically we would go to a 5 meal a day system, but they may take one or two of those meals as a drink and not as a solid.
Cool. And
Yeah,
just to follow,
I see the follow-up question.
yeah.
Do the baby is small and shows a lot of interest in food? Currently feed him only once. You can always offer more food, right? I would offer the food then the bottle in or breast. And the reason for that is I always want them to be able to top up,
Hmm.
right? So you want them to make sure that they're getting enough calories. But I'm going to state as a general statement, if you have concerns, go back to your primary caregiver, be it a nurse practitioner, a doctor, or a pediatrician, because they know your child best and they'll be able to give you more relevant information. There are guides out there put out by the CDC, and they actually say at this month do this, at this month do this, but they're guidelines, right? They're not mandated. So if you see your daughter or your child is looking interested in food, you can always offer them food, but don't assume they're going to eat a lot. They may just be interested in the taste. They might think your food is awesome.
Perfect. Thank you. So I think that's pretty much from our. Yeah, thanks for the question, Karima. I think I can go back to one of my questions then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So, yeah, my question is, can genetics play a role in developing either the liking or the hatred, right? So, towards a particular food. This is actually coming from our own home, and
Mm-hmm.
basically, the food in the question is yogurt. So, I love yogurt. Everyone else in my family loves yogurt except for Reka. She doesn't like yogurt. She doesn't like the smell of it. She doesn't like to touch it. And that has been the way ever since she was young. Now, when
Yeah.
we had our daughter, up till I think 1 year, we were giving her yogurt and all. She was fine. But overnight, it's like a flip of a switch. She started to hate it. Like right now, she doesn't even go anywhere near yogurts, right? So, just wondering, like, is it like a genetic thing? If mom or dad doesn't like or doesn't like a particular food very strongly, does it happen to have the same effect with
Maybe it's an interesting question because it's who fed her below a year yogurt. So if dad fed her, did dad have a big smile on his face? And when mom fed her, did she have a look of disgust on her face? Because that's one thing to think of. Are they associating the
Mm,
look of the parent? Because my comment is, if you don't like a food, do not serve that to your child.
okay.
Like you can serve it to them, but you got to fake it. You got to make sure that disgust curled lip isn't on there because our bodies look for disgust and
Mm.
they start to associate the two. The other thing is your daughter is nearly 2. Am I correct? Yeah. So
Now
she's
she's
starting to
two,
learn. Pardon?
now she's 2.5.
2.5, yeah. So just around 2, kids start to control the food. So if you don't make a big deal of it, it's fine. You can change yogurt. You can freeze it and make it a freezy. You can add it into things, and you can see if it's really an issue. For some children, they actually don't manage certain foods well, and they do okay until they can say no. And around 2, kids can say no. So it'd be interesting to see if mummy has problems with digesting yogurt, and that's why her daughter also doesn't like it. So
Mm,
it's something to think about. Usually, kids genetically, unless there's a gut issue, it's not because he doesn't like it, they don't like it. But I have many clients I see for significant feeding issues where a
mm,
parent has a feeding challenge and we're seeing it also in the child. That's environmental.
oh,
So typically it's environment would be the first thing to look at, but you're playing also the complexity of it. You have a 2.5-year-old who's saying, no, I'm not having that. And you're saying, but I really want you to eat this. It's really good for you. And she's like, I've got control. No, right? And so if you back off and go, okay, well, here's some other thing. I don't know. It could be love nut. It could be anything. And she eats it. It's not the white color of it. It's not that it's yogurt. It's that it's yogurt from the container. So the next time you serve it to her out of the container, or maybe she had something happen at daycare with yogurt she didn't like. There's lots of things that
yeah,
could be playing into this.
understood.
So typically no, unless it's an underlying genetic issue of intolerance.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Moving on to the next one, again from me, like how important is a dairy food, particularly milk, necessary? Of course, milk is necessary for an infant, but as we go along, right? So when they grow up to be 2 or 3, how important or how less important milk becomes.
So the milk, so typically the range is children have breast or formula until a year, and after a year they can have milk, cow's milk, and their volume of it should drop significantly. So they go from 36 ounces a day down to like 12, right? So it's a significant change, but what you're getting from dairy is protein and vitamin
Mm,
D. So if you can get protein and vitamin D in another way, cool.
cool.
But dairy is something that's in our diet. It's not in everybody's diet. So there are cultures that don't use dairy,
Yeah.
but oat milk is not the same as cow's milk.
Yeah.
Okay. Oat has no protein, right? Almond milk is closer to cow's milk. Goat's milk is even closer. So what you're looking for is a protein source, but oat milk has almost no nutritional value, right? So if you're looking at getting alternatives, you want to look for an alternative that's going to give you the same input. And so the biggest issue for kids is vitamin D deficiency and iron deficiency. So you want to make sure that those two areas are covered. And in the past, so I spend 85% of my time now dealing with children who have complex feeding issues. And almost every one of them has an iron and vitamin D deficiency. So it's become more common to see it. And I think it's because kids are eating different foods than they used to. So
Yeah.
to be aware that dairy is important to the point that it gives you some nutrients. And if you can get those nutrients in a different way, it doesn't need to be dairy.
Perfect. Thank you. Moving on, again, like just a question, another question from me. I have so many questions around food. So, how do we know when to stop giving bottles through the night? I mean, in Riva's case, what happened is one of her teachers at daycare, she
Yeah,
suggested that maybe you should stop now. And that's how we started like taking away bottles through the night.
right.
And it worked out. But in many other parents, like I saw the same question, like, okay, how do we know when to stop giving her bottles through the night?
Are they getting enough calories during the day? That's your first thing. So if they're taking in 28 ounces of milk during the day and they're eating 3 meals, they shouldn't need something overnight.
Yeah.
The main reason for that is at night when we sleep, our stomach sleeps. So if you're waking a child up or they're waking up to eat, it either means it's habit or they're not getting enough calories. So those are the kids we usually say they need a fortifying snack or dinner
Mm.
before bed. So if they're having dinner at 5 and they're having snack at 7:30 before they go to bed, that should be something that has some weight to it. So a lot of times the Italian community used to put pablum in their formula and feed it to them via the bottle, and then they slept all night because they were giving them an extra 70 or 80 calories. So part of it is their stomach big enough to take enough food in, right?
Mm.
If they do are they taking enough nutrition in? And are they waking and are hungry? Or are they waking just to suck? So if they're waking and they're hungry, if you gave them a cup, they'd be totally fine. They'd just drink the cup and go back to sleep. But if they weren't really and they want their bottle, they're using it as a self-soothing tool
Mm.
because we wake up about 6 to 8 times a night. We sleep solidly for the first 2 hours, and then we come in and out of sleep. We go into light awakening, we turn over, and we go back to sleep. And children who don't have good sleep hygiene, so they have difficulty falling asleep on their own, will wake up looking for that person that put them to sleep to come back to put them to sleep. So it's a complex question, but typically by a year, a child should be sleeping through the night.
By a year. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Next one is from Rekha. So, till what age should I breastfeed my child? I think this is a very common question that
Yes.
we have seen in many
So
parents.
what I heard from a physician at Sick Kids long ago was beyond a year, the nutritional density isn't there.
Hmm.
So the parent isn't producing that much. So if a child enjoys breastfeeding, you enjoy breastfeeding, it's not going to hurt them. I would suggest by 2, they should be off the breast. There's the Lush League would probably give you a different answer than I would, but I would say that what happens is the children um, start up breastfeeding every meal, and then some kids go down to just twice a day. They do it in the morning and they do it at night, so it's less frequently, and they're still using it as a connection point, and they're getting some nutrition from it, but not a whole bunch. So typically around a year, families will look at dropping off. Now, breastfeeding is hard. It's a lot of effort. You have to be available 24/7. You have to you have to control your intake to control their intake. So it's a lot of work. So some families can't do that. They're like, I'm working and I have 2 other kids. They just can't do it. So I'm not saying you have to do it till a year. They say if you're breastfeeding 3 months is good, but greater than 3 months is even better. And a year is sort of like the mean time that people will give up. Because kids give up. Kids will wean themselves off.
Thank you. Moving on, the next question is from Karima. So my 7-month-old is teething and he wakes up often, and the only way to soothe him is to feed him. So she's asking for any advice on that.
I don't know your child, so it's hard to give advice. I can say If they're having pain, we might want to address the pain, because when we're sleepy and tired is when we feel our pain the most. So I would suggest that looking into other ways for self-soothing other than feeding him. So will he suck on something? Are you using something like Ambisol or something on his lips or his gum? Should he talking to your physician, see if Tylenol during teething is a good idea? So sometimes you just need a little pain management during it. The other thing is wet washcloth that's been put in the freezer is something to suck on,
Hmm.
and it acts like ice, right? So it kind of reduces the pain in the area. Your son might enjoy that. Or the teether rings. You see the teether rings that they put in the fridge? That may also be something. If he's looking for something to bite on, that's typically because when you bite down, it takes the pain away.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks, Karima, for that question. So moving on, we have Franca.
Yes. My
Sorry, I
answer
hope
is
I'm
yes.
saying your name right. Uh,
Frank, yeah.
so the question is, can water be introduced in an open cup along with meals at 6 months?
Yes. Yes. You see many children do it. I do a small cup. I tend to use a shot glass that size. A lot of the Arabic countries have these small, round, shallow cups that they use for children who are breastfeeding because they can get their mouth over the lip and they can lap with their tongue on it. So go really small. And the reason you go small is you don't want them getting too much at once. But yes, they can very much use cup.
Got it. Thanks for this question. And yeah, I think we have a follow-up question from not a question, but I think a statement from Karima is that looks like she tried everything with her child with the teething, but he still cries and only sleeps back when feeding is done.
Right.
So
And the problem is without knowing your child in the situation, it wouldn't be good for me to give you advice at this point, but I would suggest talking to your healthcare professional about it, because if it's consistent, then maybe they need to understand the breadth of the problem for you. And the easiest thing to do is to give them data. So on Monday, he woke up 4 times. I fed him 4 times. I tried X, Y, and Z. If you give it to them in a data sheet, they're more likely to listen to you. If you just say he cries all night, if I don't feed him, it's different. It's a different take. And that's from years of experience of dealing with physicians. You need to give them data, because from data, they can make results. So if you sat down and did your last week of how many times he was, when he was teething, he was having problems, they may take a look in his mouth to see what's going on, right? Because he may have some abscesses from the teeth.
hmm.
And I don't know. So I can't really answer for you.
Yep. Okay, moving on. Karima, hope that is helpful. But you guys can feel free to reach us at this email ID if you have like a further questions, and we can try giving you some more advice based on the question, based on the situation. I think for today's session we have like one last question again from me, and we are almost
Mhm.
at time. So my question is, it's about baby-led weaning versus traditional. I know we covered this slide, and Cathy, you mentioned that it depends, right? So it depends on which situation, what to choose, and all. But is there something like one better than the other, like benefits to one and pros and cons kind of thing?
So the pros of baby-led weaning is you're kind of skipping puree. Okay, you're skipping puree and then you go back to puree. It's not that you aren't doing puree. You're doing things in long pieces, and the kids are choosing what food they want to try. So that's the big pieces of it. So it means that the parent has to stay on track of what foods the child has tried in a
Hmm.
different way. So we had carrots tonight, and I prepared the carrot correctly for him. So it's soft, or maybe it was really hard on purpose because I didn't want him biting too much off at a time. So I had to sit beside him when I did that, and he really enjoyed it when it was roasted. So I've got carrot. He's done carrot. So I'm not going to give him a new food for a couple days just to make sure he's okay. But he really liked carrot, so I know that. But um, what I find, so I see kids when baby-led weaning didn't work. So I can tell you what happens in baby-led weaning, it doesn't work. The parent was really concerned about them choking. So they constantly went, are they choking? Are they choking? Are they choking? And they don't really have the cooking skills to shift the food, to decide when to broil a food, when to roast the food, when to steam a food. And you can get lots of support on that to find that, but it's a lot of effort. So if it's part of your family and this is what you've always done, it's not an issue. The traditional methods worked for piles of years, but it's very dogmatic. You do this, you do it for 3 days, then you do this, and you do it for 3 days. So it doesn't always work for kids on the go or kids who are in daycare, right? So if a child's in a daycare environment, you don't have control over the middle of their food if they're in daycare before a year, right? Because baby-led weaning kind of goes to about a year. So, dentists go back to work at 6 weeks. So if they've gone back to work at 6 weeks and the baby's in a daycare next door, there's a different connection on who's feeding them. So baby-led weaning works when the kid's at home, they're being fed by 1 to 2 caregivers, and everybody's on top of it. Traditional feeding works well when it can be anyone feeding, but they follow the same pathway. So we did carrots, and then we did squash, and then they do all the vegetable first, and then they do all the fruits. And that works well for kids who are maybe have lots of allergies and you're not too sure. The children who I see who've had difficulties typically were choking on the food, and people weren't recognizing it as a choke. They thought it was a gag. And so they start to avoid foods that are certain colors, and then they narrow and narrow and narrow, and then they'll only eat out of a pouch. So I get them and they have a pouch food and a cookie, and that's all they have. And we don't want that. So if baby-led weaning works really well when there's a good dance between the parent and child. Traditional feeding will work well whether the dance is fabulous or not. So
God, yeah, comes down to the situations
yeah,
and
and there's more ability to cook, like actually cook needs to be in place for baby-led weaning. So you have to be able to change your food from crispy to soft to hard to whatever, right? Because you can cook carrots in many different ways.
Right.
Carrots are the food every parent says I want my child to eat, and that's why I use carrots as an example. And almost every one of the kids I work with hate carrots. So
Absolutely. I think we have one more question about resources actually from Francha. Could you please recommend good websites or apps for baby-led weaning? I think on one of the slides you mentioned a couple of Instagram accounts that
right. So feeding littles, at feeding littles. It's what's cool about feeding littles is the OT plays the toddler throughout the whole thing. So you get a lot of the scenes with her. So she's funny to watch. They've written cookbooks for baby-led weaning, and they have a course for it. And the other one is Marsha John Klein, who is the international guru for it. And she has a site, which is the Get Permission approach. And both of those have mini courses on baby-led weaning.
Got it. Thank you, Cathy. And Francha, if you haven't caught it, don't worry. Like I'll send you a message after this with the resources that Cathy just mentioned. So I think that's pretty much it for today. We are almost at time. Cathy, I must say thank you so much. This is very good information and very detailed information. This definitely, I hope, like it provided a lot of value for our visitors today. So thank you so much. And guys who joined us, thank you for your time. And don't forget, we are going to post this in a couple of days onto our YouTube, and I'm going to send you a follow-up emails with the links where you can watch the recordings. And also we are going to do, I think, Cathy, 2 more with you, right? So as part of the series, and we are going to fix up the dates, and I'm going to send you emails to register for those as well. So thank you for being here, and have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.